Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Women of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. I'm so excited to talk with Audrey Hanks today. Audrey and I are good friends from the advisement community, but I've just always really loved a lot of the things that we've talked about. And so that's why we're doing this interview today. So Audrey, welcome.
Thank you.
So the first question I have is actually about who you are and how you came to work at BYU.
Wonderful. This is definitely not a straightforward story. And I actually think that's a big part of what's important for us to talk about is how so many of our paths in life don't take a straight trajectory. Let me start with my educational background. I came to BYU as an undergraduate to study mathematics education. And there were a lot of majors I wanted to have, but I came back to math education. I graduated with my bachelor's and I taught for 2.5 years in the middle school and junior high math classrooms. Then I went to graduate school. I came back to BYU and got my master's degree in math education. I taught at BYU a little bit. I taught some math courses and some math education courses. So that's my educational background. During all this time, I met my husband right after I graduated from BYU, and we dated and got married. I had my first baby on the last day of teaching school at the end of my public school teaching career. And so my oldest was 3 months old when I started graduate school. So I started here with a little baby in tow and started on that journey. During my master's degree, I had another baby during the middle of that. So when I graduated, I had my oldest 2 children. After that, I really wanted to go get a PhD. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, who I wanted to study with, and it was in a different state. My husband was very supportive and said, great, we'll move there. We'll do what it takes. And I prayed and fasted, and it was not the right thing for me to do at that time. And that was very disappointing for me. But I also trusted my promptings, and I thought, what comes next? So I was going to continue to teach adjunct through BYU, and that ended up not being the right path either. So I ended up feeling guided to be a stay-at-home mom. So I was a stay-at-home mom for about 10 years. During that time, I volunteered in my children's schools. I was involved in the school community council. I actually participated pretty heavily in some in-service activities through the schools, but primarily I was a stay-at-home mom during that time. I had many opportunities for employment, but felt like it wasn't the right time for that. So then during that time, we ended up moving back. We had moved away from this area and we moved back here for my husband to get his PhD. And while he was getting his PhD, in the meantime, I had several more children. So I have 7 children. My oldest is 17, my baby is 2. And during this time, right after my 6th baby was born, I ended up kind of happening into this job. And I had met someone who said, hey, we just posted this job. I think you should apply for it. And I'd had that happen many times before, and I prayed about it, and this time it was right. So I applied and started this job almost 4 years ago as an advisor for students who are pursuing scholarships after they graduate. And I had another baby during that time. So I worked part-time. I worked half-time when I started, and I'm a 3/4 time employee now at BYU.
So there are so many pieces of your story that I'm just enthralled with, because I feel like one of the purposes of what we do is to have conversations about how there are different times in your life where you're making different decisions, and where there are certain trade-offs that you're making. And overall, I feel very connected to the faith that you had while you were making these decisions. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's going to be really important for this population to understand that life can look all these different kinds of ways, and that it's really important to and integral in those life decisions to have the faith to move forward with all the different paths that you can take. So I guess in our conversations between you and me, we've talked a lot about integrating these various aspects of our lives when it comes to pursuing education or career and family. And so I'm hoping that maybe you can expand. What has your process been when selecting which aspect to prioritize? Like, maybe let's dive into the I prayed about it and I felt good piece. Like, what did that look like for you?
I think that's this to me is one of the most key components, something I teach my children all the time. One of the most important things that my husband and I work to teach our children is that one of the most fundamental and important lessons that they can learn early is how the Spirit feels when it's speaking to them and how to receive personal revelation. I think about when you come to those really pivotal moments and have to make a decision, to be sure about what that feels like for you, and being to know, oh, that's the Spirit. I know that is what that is. That means even when it's scary and it doesn't seem like it makes sense, then you can move forward because you have confidence in your ability to receive personal revelation. I think especially, I don't know if this is generational. I think probably older generations struggled with this more than our generation struggles with it. But our ability as women to access the Spirit to give us personal revelation and not be dependent on others for our personal revelation is a really important thing for us to come into. And I think that I started to make a practice of this when I was in college. I decided I want to know what the Spirit feels like for me. Those thoughts coming to me, is that the Spirit? Is that me? I don't know what that is. And I decided one day, I want to know what that is. And so I need to start taking actions that will help me figure that out. So I actually started I basically told Heavenly Father, I know that if I'm receiving an prompting or inspiration and I'm not acting on it, I'm probably going to receive fewer of those in the future. But if I act on it, I'm more likely to receive more. So if I'm not sure if it's a prompting or not, I'm going to go forward and act as if it is. And that way, hopefully I'll receive more and it will become clearer over time. And it did. And it's a process. It took years and years. I still am doing that to some degree. But that confidence in knowing what that feels like when Heavenly Father speaks to me is a big component here, because then when I was seeking those answers, I could confirm to myself that is the Spirit indicating which way I should go. So I think that's an important background piece of that. Second, I think you have to have faith and believe that Heavenly Father's plan for you is better than any plan you could imagine for yourself. And sometimes it doesn't feel that way. There have been times I've been devastated and felt like I was pursuing a good and righteous thing that I thought Heavenly Father even maybe wanted me to be pursuing. And the answer in the end ended up being no, or not right now. And that was really disappointing for me and devastating for me. But what anchored me was that I believe that ultimately our heavenly parents have greater vision than we do, and that we can't even imagine what they have in store for us. And if we are willing to trust their plan for us, that we can have more beautiful things than if we're trying to control and force every little thing that we think is the way it needs to work out. I actually have a really beautiful quote about that. Rich Osgathorpe, he's the associate academic vice president. He's one of the associate academic vice presidents. And he gave this quote earlier this semester. He said, whatever our aspiration is, you can picture that in your mind's eye and what that looks like. The heavens have a much grander vision than we could ever imagine. So as we use these as our North Stars, I think we also need to keep in mind that whatever we think it might look like in its greatest, grandest, most aspirational, most wonderful form, the possible outcomes are greater than we could ever imagine. That's what I hope for. And I love that quote from him. And it's made me think a lot about the ways we maybe limit ourselves by not allowing Heavenly Father to guide our path.
Yeah. And I appreciate the testimony that you shared. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind, and this wasn't part of our original notes for this, but just based on our conversations in the past, what were some of the things that were hard where you thought you were headed down and you felt like it was, a righteous desire, and then maybe came up against a brick wall, but then it led you to something greater? Do you have an example that you would be willing to share?
Yeah, I have one that I'm going to say now that I don't know that I have a hard conclusion to this, but I can share two different stories, and one of them is still in progress, and the other one is a little bit more concluded. But as I finished my master's degree in math education, I had been studying estimation with fractions with middle school aged students for my thesis, which was fine. But as I was concluding my degree, I had the opportunity to participate in a faculty roundtable where we were reading a book out loud, or we were reading, not out loud, we were reading a book together, but then coming together to discuss it. And we came to discuss this book. And as we were reading in there, I started to find this deep love for this work we were studying. And it was critical discourse analysis in education, which sounds like all this stuff. But the reason I got into math education was because I believe that there are so many students who are made to feel inadequate, made to feel not enough. They are taught math in the ways that in one way that their math teacher learned it and was successful at it. And many math teachers are not willing to approach teaching math from several different perspectives. And so it makes our students feel really inadequate. I've been in that case. I mean, I've been in a university classroom where I was just absolutely humiliated by the professor because I did not understand what was going on. And I feel strongly about teaching students math in ways that they can understand and access so that they don't have those feelings. They don't have to choose it as a career, but to not leave feeling like they could never be smart enough to understand it, those things. So this critical discourse analysis within education was looking at the ways that discourse in classrooms and even the subtext happening in classrooms was limiting access to education for our students. And this is something I feel so strongly about. And I was really excited about this work. And right at the end of the semester, a woman from Michigan came out to speak to us about her work in math education surrounding critical discourse analysis. And she came and she spoke to us, and that was the work that I wanted to do. And I was so excited. I went and talked to her afterwards, and she said, apply right now. You can come and be I'll be your advisor, like come out here. I was so excited. And that was when we prayed and fasted, and the answer was no. And I was so disappointed. And it's interesting because I felt so guided to go into math education. But I think the benefit of me not pursuing that was, I don't think the work that I really am going to do ultimately is going to be in math education. It's going to be in education more generally. And had I done that, I think I would have gotten very narrowly pigeonholed into a certain kind of work. And it would have been good work and work I think I would have loved in some ways, but I don't think it would have been the tool that I needed to affect the kind of change that I'm actually hoping to affect. And so at that time I was really disappointed, but now I'm really grateful that I didn't get into this really narrow focus that would have perhaps prevented me from being able to do the work that I'm hoping to be able to do in the long run. So that's one story. The second story is more recently, I felt like it was time again for me to start pursuing further education. And I felt really led by the Spirit to pursue a very particular program. And this was about 2 years ago. I applied really last minute. I was accepted and I was very excited about it, but it was in the UK. And my husband and I prayed about what to do, and we'd felt led there. But the hurdles to actually getting our whole family there and living while I was doing this program were seemed fairly impossible, but we believed if it was the right thing, we could do it. And we continued to pursue that path for a few months, and then ended up ultimately feeling like it wasn't the right thing to do. And I was devastated, and I was really angry, honestly, for a little while. I was pretty angry with Heavenly Father, and felt like he had led me to this thing that I thought was a good and righteous desire to help give me the tools that I needed to affect change in access and equity for children and education. And then he told me no, and I was very confused, and I was really angry for a little while. And then I was able to step away from that anger a little bit over time, and remember that, and really I remembered the whole time that I truly do believe he has a better plan for me, but I was confused and I was frustrated. And I've seen, for personal reasons since then, why it was a very good thing we did not end up over there over the last 2 years. A huge blessing that we did not end up in the UK over the last couple of years for personal reasons, but that really hasn't soothed my soul in the way that some might think. So this is the middle of the story, but I also really believe and hope for the good things to come. I believe that they are there for me, and I'm starting to see doors open right now that wouldn't have happened had I taken that path. And I don't know where they will lead, but I also believe deeply, as that quote attested to, that his vision is so much grander than my vision could be.
Thank you. Thank you so much for diving into some deep and personal questions. I just think it's important for people to hear and understand, like, this process is kind of, I mean, the gospel truths are simple, right? But the process is just a little messy sometimes. And I love that you shared that this was something that you and your family considered. And so my question for you now is, like, what does that look like with your partner, right? Like, you're receiving personal revelation, he's receiving personal revelation. What does that mean for your family, especially when it's come to some of these, kind of harder things in which you shared that you felt devastated by a little bit?
I think one of the keys here is recognizing that different people come to conclusions at different times. So this is something that's been true between me and my husband over time. I'm usually I'm pretty quick. Like, I go through, I really pray hard about something, and often the answer will come fairly quickly to me. And my husband is much more meticulous in the way he examines these things, and for him, revelation sometimes takes longer than it takes for me. Not because one of us is better at it than the other. It just is, I think, our combination of our personality and who we are. And again, the ways that the Spirit speaks to us is very different for each person. And so sometimes it's hard when I feel I've gotten an answer and he still hasn't gotten an answer yet. I'm like, come on, let's get there, and it's been really important for me to step back and give him the space to receive revelation, because our family, that's a complicated part about personal revelation, is when you are receiving revelation for a family and when it affects several people, it isn't just me getting an answer for my family. The two of us need to come together to do this. We have a very equal partnership. I would say that our entire marriage, I believe that to be true. I do feel like in the last year or so, it's become even more so, and largely because we've come to recognize patterns that we've inherited that we didn't recognize were actually barriers to us being as equal partners as we could. So when we have entered into some of these decisions, we don't always receive revelation at the same rates. And there have been times when my husband has received it sooner than I have. But I think stepping back and trusting, if this is the right answer, Heavenly Father will give that answer to my husband as well as me. And if it's and I think that's the timing piece of that is really important. So as we've tried to make some of these decisions together, it can be a little complicated when you take into account these different aspects. And you have to think, do we both, I think sometimes our desires and I know that our desires and where our hearts are greatly influence the ability for the Spirit to speak to us. If we don't want an answer, if we don't want a certain answer, it's going to be hard for Heavenly Father to give us a clear answer sometimes when that's the case. So really having our hearts and minds both open to possibilities is a really important piece of that.
You mentioned how your partnership has been strengthened over the last year or so. Can you talk maybe in detail about like what that kind of looks like as you've been balancing career, family, church responsibility? Can you maybe give some examples of what that partnership looks like for you and what that means for our women students as they're potentially in similar family situations or will be?
One of the things that's really important to recognize in a marriage is there is a shift sometimes of who needs more help, who is in a place where they can give more and who needs maybe a little bit more of the receiving at that time. So it's natural to have some ebb and flow, but what's really important is to look over the long haul and try to examine, is this imbalanced, or is this just the natural flow of going back and forth? And I don't know that there's always a clear answer for that. So I think that can be easy to fall into unhealthy patterns when we just attribute it to this natural ebb and flow, but later look back and think, wait a minute, I was giving more this whole time, or my husband maybe was giving more this whole time. So I think we need to really step back and reflect regularly to see, is this part of the natural flow of what this looks like? A few years ago, my husband was talking to a professor at BYU, and she was sharing her idea of what it means to preside, because that can be a tricky and hard word for a lot of people. And she said her interpretation of presiding is ensuring that every member of the family gets their chance to learn and grow, and the rest of the family surrounding them and supporting them as that happens. And that means that sometimes one person's getting a lot more support than someone else. And that happens. I have a child who's medically complicated. Two of my other children are on the autism spectrum. And there have definitely been times when some of my other children have been really frustrated because they're like, they get all the attention, or they get off and we have to do all the work, or whatever's happening. But part of being in a family is supporting and lifting one another in their growth and development. And sometimes that isn't always, sometimes again, that shifts over time for who is receiving that kind of help. But often the wife, the mother, is the last one whose growth and development is considered. And that is one thing that I think is really important when you're choosing a partner in life, is to choose someone who very clearly puts your needs and your growth as high, if not higher than their own, that they see you as a person whose growth and development is just as essential as anyone else's in your family. And sometimes that can be hard to really determine before you get married, but I would encourage you to really delve into that as much as you can before you get married, because once you get married, I still think there's growth that for sure can happen. But once you're in a marriage where your growth and development is maybe put on the back burner because of what your husband sees your role to be, it's a lot harder to push for that once you're already in your marriage. I think that can be a more challenging situation. So some of us, once you're in your marriage, that that may continue to last for you, and you may have to figure out and wrestle with what that looks like. But a really great way to enter into your marriage is with someone who already feels that way about you and your growth and development.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I know that there are a lot of individuals who feel, just kind of pushed and pulled when I mean, dating is already so hard. And you and I have had conversations about that. So if any of you are listening to this and you just need to come and commiserate with us about that, please come and talk to us, because we have some things to say, but we won't get into that. So thank you so much for that. Well, I kind of wanted to shift gears a little bit. Thank you so much for being so open and willing to talk about these things. But what are some things just in your role or even in your academic experience at BYU? What unique pressures do you see our women students navigating as they're seeking to know more about their potential, especially as it relates to post-graduation opportunities, whether or not those opportunities are, working full-time, part-time, or choosing to be a stay-at-home mom?
We have, I think, a lot of unique pressures. I think women in general, even outside of our faith and our culture, have a lot of pressures in this area. But I think in particular, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who are women definitely have some particular pressures that they have going into these kinds of decisions. I think one of the biggest limiting factors is ourselves. I think so often we limit ourselves and keep ourselves small. We are often taught about motherhood and what a great sacrifice it is and how much it means to give to other people, and that's how we should spend our life. And I believe those things are true in some ways. I don't know that the ways we are taught them are always completely true, but I believe that a life of service and love is a joyful life and is a meaningful life. But what that service and love look like for you and the people around you maybe looks different than some of the ways that we are taught. Maybe the greatest gift you could give to your children is show them how you are growing and developing and seeking opportunities that make you a better person, and your service for people to make the world a better place. That might be the greatest gift. But I think sometimes the things that we are taught when we are younger cause us to limit ourselves and make us feel like we need to be small and not demand things and not rock the boat. And so sometimes I think we are the greatest limiters of ourselves. Unfortunately, I know that's certainly been true in my life, that even now, I sometimes get afraid and think, no, I shouldn't, I don't know if I should want this thing, or this seems too big of an ask from my family. It would be really uncomfortable for my family if I pursued this opportunity. And I really have to talk to myself in important ways to counteract those limitations of making myself small.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about some other things, but do you want to
No,
anything on that?
no. Can you just
Right.
keep going?
Okay. I do think, unfortunately, pressures from faculty members and other members of our institution are sometimes a pressure. I have had women come to me and say that they have had professors who have refused to write letters of recommendation for them for PhD or for medical school because they don't want to take away opportunities from the men in our population to have those to be able to support their family. Very disappointing stories that I've heard about faculty members who've done things like that, or even just more subtle and subversive ways that they have undermined our women's goals and aspirations to go on to graduate school, to do really wonderful things after they leave here that are perhaps not within the walls of their home. And that is disappointing to me. I don't know how much of that is maybe an older generation versus a younger generation of faculty members, but that is still a sad pressure that I see happening occasionally. Family, lots of times families are a big pressure in choosing to avoid it. I know that elements of my family have been very unsupportive in my pursuit of greater education, whether that's my married family or my family of origin. I have had a lot. I've had some members who've been very supportive, and I have some who've been very, very vocal in the ways that this would harm my family and my children if I pursued things like this. So that is a pressure, and sometimes it's not quite so overt, but it can still be hard when your support network, which you're going to need when you pursue some of these things, is maybe not willing to be quite as supportive because they don't believe in the path that you're taking.
So what did you do to kind of overcome? Because, I know for myself, my family is a huge and important aspect of what helps me kind of move through the decision-making process. I know for me, I actually don't get very clear direction. And I'm always that person who's like, is this me? Is this the spirit? And then, kind of going back
Mhm.
to some of the things that we've talked about already. So, and then faculty members that I revere and respect and probably do have my best interest in mind, but in ways and views and biases that kind of inform what they're trying to accomplish, right? So I'm curious to know, what did you do? What were some avenues, what were some things that you had to remember to kind of move through that as you've pursued different um things for your life?
Um, I think I part of that has been coming back to the peace that I feel when I'm pursuing something. It's hard because sometimes I get anxious and agitated because I have anxiety. So that's part of that. But sometimes it can be because I'm not doing the right thing, and sometimes it's just because I have a challenging thing ahead of me that's going to be tough. And sometimes it's hard for me to tease apart which one of those is guiding this feeling of anxiety if I'm moving forward. But I try really hard to kind of to return to the peace that I felt when I did decide to move forward. That can be an anchor, but like you said, not everyone gets as clear of an answer, and that can be hard to do. I think one thing that's really important is to find a network, find a community who is supportive, and maybe that's your own built and found community, but finding a community who is willing to support you, to say, yes, this is hard, but you're doing a good thing. And maybe that doesn't mean that you end your other relationships, but maybe you place some boundaries, and maybe you don't ask them, because if anytime you ask them for help, they remind you of the fact that they aren't thrilled that you're pursuing that opportunity. But if you can create a found community who is supportive, that can
Mhm.
be wonderful. That could be on campus, wherever you end up. If you're in school, that can be in a job, that can be neighbors and friends, that could be a book club, that could be, I actually was in a book club years and years ago, and all of the women in it had some, at least one graduate degree. We had doctors, we had lawyers, we had professors. I don't, I, it, how it even came about was kind of a crazy story, but I ended up joining this group that already existed, and it was such a relief to have a place I could go and talk about these things that I was struggling with or excited about, and know that I had support from other women who saw this path as a viable path, and I appreciated that.
I love that advice. I think that that's something that I personally need right now. So thank you so much for that. Um, we've hit on a lot of these things already, but I'm curious. I've been to conferences lately in the Utah area where there's been some discussion about how women in Utah often settle for opportunities after they graduate. Settle being like a, I don't know, we can leave that as ambivalent as we want. But what are you seeing just in your profession in terms of women students who are pursuing more education or a career? You kind of mentioned some of the things, but like what are some other barriers or mindsets that you've maybe needed to help coach them through?
I think that a lot of the women who I have seen who have come in, they there's this idea of humility, which is really important for us to have. But I don't think that humility means believing that you should stay small. And I think sometimes that we confuse humility with a feeling of not like I shouldn't want too much. I shouldn't dream too big. I shouldn't go and grab this thing. And I don't think that version of humility is serving us. I think it is something I have to talk about with some of the students who I work with, to talk about the ways that you have done important and wonderful things. And it is important to celebrate that. Now, you didn't do them independently, you did do them with other people. One interesting aspect of my work is I help students write applications. And in some of the applications, it'll have a leadership essay, for instance. And so many of our students, in particular women students, although some of our men students do it too, they have a very hard time writing these leadership essays without using the word we all the way through it. But the whole point is, what did they do? But all of it is, we did this and we did this, and they don't want to claim ownership of any of these aspects. And I really have to have a lot of conversations about, I can understand why it's important to recognize group efforts, but it's also really important to acknowledge you are doing good and important work. And that is okay to acknowledge. And by acknowledging that, then I think it frees us up to be more audacious in our dreaming, to say, maybe I could want this thing. Maybe I could look beyond this lowest level of maybe what I thought was possible. Maybe I could push further to a job that maybe I'm not fully qualified for, but I would love to grow into. That would be wonderful. But I think some of that takes some acknowledgement of, what have you done? You have done some important and wonderful things, and let's acknowledge and celebrate that, recognizing that a lot of it is maybe part of a team effort, but that you had an important contribution to that. And I think that can be an important step for moving forward in ways that expand our vision of maybe what we might like or feel possible.
I love that. I struggle with that too, right? Because you read books like Leaders Eat Last, or something like that, where it's kind of this common we conversation. Like, is it really your team or is it the team? But I like when you are going, there are different nuances associated with using I versus we. When you're doing an application, when you're applying for a job, right? Like, those are some really, really important things. And not only that, but even just to be able to reflect on, no, I really do have these strengths. And sometimes I forget that. And I think that that's a really important piece as well. So I really appreciate that feedback. I think that's really great.
I think, really quick, if you don't
Yeah,
mind,
please.
just for me to go on that, I notice often our self-talk perpetuates a lot of that. A lot of the things we repeat to ourselves, and our heads can do that. And I find that I've done that a lot over my life. And we talked about this the other day, but I recently was working on a personal development for myself, and I really had to be reminded of why I was experiencing a lot of negative self-talk. Like, why are you even trying to do this? This is outside of, this is a reach. I don't know if you should be doing this. And I took Post-it notes and I wrote on them in Sharpie, and I posted them all over the edges of my laptop screen and where I was working. And I wrote things like, you have a lot to contribute. You are an asset. And I wrote notes that were reminders to think differently than I had been thinking. And it was really powerful. And it was encouraging for me to remember, no, it's true. I do have a lot that I can add. And sometimes it's easy for us to get in these other ways of thinking. But I think sometimes, even if it takes putting Post-it notes up to counteract the self-talk that you have that's maybe holding you back, that can be an empowering tool you can use.
I love that suggestion. I prescribe to that as well. So you should see my office. Well, Audrey, as we're kind of wrapping up here, is there anything else that you wanted to share that will empower our women students to pursue whatever it is that they choose post-graduation?
One of the things I wish I had learned earlier is this idea that you don't have to choose at the beginning of your path one thing or another thing, and then never have the opportunity to readjust what that looks like in your life. For instance, I think a lot of times we're told, are you going to have a career or are you going to be a stay-at-home mom? And you kind of have to choose then. And once you choose then, that is the path you're on. And I wish I had known earlier that I can look at it as each individual phase in my life. What's best for right now? Maybe that's education. Maybe that's stay-at-home mom, but being involved still in volunteer opportunities. Maybe it's just being a stay-at-home mom. Sometimes when my daughter, who's medically complicated, was born for about 2 years, all I did was care for her. I mean, that was just the reality of my life. And it was an honor to be able to care for her, but it meant other things weren't happening at that time. And there have been times when I'm working and times when I'm in school, and it's been a rich life because I've been open over time to what does this season look like in my life, instead of deciding at the beginning, I either have a career or I stay at home, or it doesn't have to be binary. We don't have to choose a path and have that be the thing we're stuck on forever. I think there can be much more fluidity in what that looks like for each of us, and celebrate that season. Celebrate if your years need to be stay at home right now. Celebrate if that time is for education. Celebrate if that time is for working. Often it's many of those things at the same time. It is often not just one of those. And instead of being paralyzed by, I need to make a decision now for what's going to happen for the rest of my life, say, what's the next right step? What is the next right thing for me? And what does this next season need to look like? And then evaluate regularly, you know, periodically through the year, every couple of years, maybe have a really good sit down and say, where are we at? And what does the next step need to look like? And I think if you can be open to that path looking less clear cut, there can really be some rich opportunities for you that can add a lot of beauty to your life and a lot of experiences that other people who maybe strictly have careers maybe and don't have families, maybe they won't have as much experience to bring to the table in a situation that you might have by having a rounded out experience. And maybe your path is just a career. It could look like different things for each person, but being open to that shifting over time.
I love that. Well, thank you so, so much. I just have always appreciated our conversations and really your willingness to be open and vulnerable. And my hope is that women will be able to listen to this and start to make adjustments as they seek their own personal revelation and what that means during different times in their lives. I have been so blessed to meet with you today. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. And also, I'm always happy to chat with anyone about what that path looks like for them. So if any students find this and want to come chat, I'm always happy to have that conversation.
Awesome. We'll go ahead and we'll post your information on the YouTube channel.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.